Right, we are a minute past the hour, so don't want to delay the inevitable any further. So very welcome to this Turnkey Key Insights webinar. Today we're talking about the business integrity screening modules, but more importantly, the reasons why that exists and how we can make best use of it today. So we're looking at sanctioned party screening and the importance of understanding both our business partners and our suppliers, employees, and everybody else that we do business with. Of course, in the tagline of how we can make the world a safer place to do business. So, on to the session itself. Firstly, I should introduce myself. For those of you that aren't aware, I'm Simon Persin, Director of Operations for Turnkey, based in the UK, but have a global role working through the service lines that we offer to the market, and also running the delivery function to make sure that the quality standards that we set ourselves are endorsed and adhered to across our global delivery remit. I'm very happy to be joined here today as well by Andrew Morris. Andrew, would you like to introduce yourself to the group?
Thanks, Simon. Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew Morris. I am one of the application and cybersecurity architects for Turnkey Consulting. I'm based in the UK. I have hands-on experience of implementing business integrity screening for a number of our customers, and I've also been an official trainer for SAP on the tool itself.
Fantastic. So any of you guys who are wanting to post questions, whether they're technical or functional, please use the chat boxes or the Q&A boxes, and we'll try and make sure that Andrew has to answer the difficult ones so that I don't have to. Nobody needs that. So on with the webinar. So as I mentioned, what we're looking at today really is how to automate sanctioned party screenings, but more importantly, what we need to address is why that's so important in the first place. So we need to get the visibility of our business partners, no matter what kind of business partners they are. But more importantly than that is what's just changed and how has that evolved into the current operating world that we live in. So once we've looked at those two business problems, the as is and what's changed, we'll then start to take a little bit of a look as to how the SAP platforms allow us to do that more automatically and more collectively to manage the business risk more appropriately. So without further ado, let's get into the actual topic. So we have a myriad of different business partners in our working lives at the moment. That could be customers. Customers are business partners too. It could be suppliers. It could be our own employees. But whichever type of person or interaction we're looking at between corporate to corporate or individual to individual, we need to know who they are. And the only way we can do that is to screen them, is to understand who they are and what sort of links that they do have. So why is this important? Well, sometimes it's regulatory mandated. So know your customer, for example. Things in the financial services sector, there are laws and regulations in place to do with it. Global financing of terror, anti-money laundering regulations, for example, are common reasons for why we might need to screen some of our business partners. But we may want to do it for other reasons as well. So global embargoes, sanctioned parties, or for just the protection of our own financial revenues. So it would be quite interesting to know, for example, whether 50% of our employees have already had convictions for money laundering crimes or financial irregularities, or have knowingly been convicted of committing fraud. So employing those sorts of people may well be a risk too far for the business operations. But importantly, we should also need to know about some of the people that don't work for us. So some of our suppliers, some of our customers, or any other relationships that we're building throughout the world. So understanding exactly who we're working with, who we're connected to for financial loss, fraud prevention, or just for adverse media relations or for reputational damage is vital to understand the picture about how we do business. Particularly in complicated supply chains, understanding that those suppliers are also ethical and are actually aligning to our own corporate objectives, our own compliance requirements, and our standards and values is really, really vital. Andrew, anything else to add on that front?
No, it's something that's becoming increasingly common as well. You know, the importance to react quickly to dynamic changes to the world. So what you check for today might no longer be valid tomorrow. So understanding who your customers are and having the ability to quickly revalidate on certain data is critical more than ever.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as I say, the educated consumer is looking more and more at those corporate bodies to not just protect their financial and corporate behaviors, but also the more ethical behaviors as well. So the changing world of what could go wrong is not just about bankruptcy of the business, but suppliers leaving you and you not being able to service your customers, or not being able to dominate the markets that you're working in because of consumer behavior and that more intelligent view as to what you're about. So, Andrew, with all of your experiences of implementing these sorts of things, what kind of checks have you seen, and how are you seeing that business partners are being screened or not?
So there's many different ways. No company is quite the same. And actually, as I cover some of the common use cases, what I'd like is for our participants, if you can just quickly drop in the chat what your company does, if there's anything different or anything unique or some other challenges, it'd be interesting to hear from you. But typically, know your business partner, know your customer. These processes aren't new. They've been in place for many years. But trying to perform it for a large number of suppliers or vendors is always a challenge. Many organizations will do them periodically. You simply cannot check every customer frequently. So they will organize them on a periodic basis, once a quarter, once a month. Maybe those with a bigger financial value to the organization. So not checking everybody on a regular basis. There's always a reliance still on supplier self-assessments. It's the most common way and often the easiest way of getting data from a vendor. Please fill out this form, and you can do some Excel calculations in the background that flags anything you need to investigate internally. Some of the challenges there, though, is that it's not always updated afterwards. You might find something on there that you need to investigate. You have an email conversation with suppliers, and it's not necessarily captured in that self-assessment form. It's not always up to date, and then it's left there and not always updated afterwards. Manual reviews and investigations is the other one. So choosing who to do a manual review on, but there's not always tooling in place to do it. So it's a manual reinvestigation, revisiting the supplier self-assessment, checking against sanctions list to see if there's been any updates for key ones. Investigations are often manual and time consuming rather than system-led checking on certain key facts. And more commonly, most of the business partner checks are done at the corporate level. So at the organization itself, certainly from an organization to organization point of view. But as Simon said, though, often customers are looking beyond just the company name now. Who does your partner work with? Who owns them? Is there any politically exposed people in there? Have they been investigated for any adverse reports? So who actually runs your business partners? Many are still done at that corporate level. Just looking at the chat, sanction changes from list providers screened daily against all stored business partners. Fantastic. That's one of the ideal solutions. So it's good. Investigation strategy. That's a question I'll come back to, but we'll save some questions for the end. Still largely most organizations, it's manually led, heavily resource occupies a lot of resources. And there was a report the other month that about 20% of organizations still don't do any basic due diligence at all, or certainly consistency across their supplier vendors across the database.
Yeah, I'd endorse that as well. I mean, certainly as a consulting firm, we're often going onto supplier lists, getting onboarding new clients to us, and therefore we're being a new supplier for them. And the amount of time that we just get a very simple form to fill in and asked all of the sort of information security framework questions, asked some of the ownership side of things, but more often than not, it's very basic information just for corporate registration numbers and anything else like that. We certainly don't have huge visibility about whether the employees that work for us are screened or whether there's any further screening that happens as part of a due diligence of new supplier onboarding. Rest assured though, at Turnkey, when we're onboarding new suppliers, we do take it seriously. We do ask the questions and we do seek external validation and do our due diligence, because it would be silly if we didn't, wouldn't it? And we do screen our customers as well, just so you're aware. So what has changed? Well, clearly over the past few months, there's been some widespread news about increases in sanctioned parties, some more embargoes that are coming on, particularly about geopolitical influences. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but you'd have to have your head in a very big sandpit to not understand some of those changes that have happened, particularly in the embargoes and sanctioned parties. But the interesting thing is that as well as it being companies and corporate levels, it's individuals as well. So the ownership rights and that web of transparency of who owns exactly what asset is becoming more and more important. And certainly where a lot of the information is based upon voluntary submissions and self-governed in terms of UK Companies House, for example, that can add a real level of complexity to all of those different parties that are being screened. So who owns what and who still has control of what is a really difficult question to ask and answer. And it depends on whether you're at a country level legislative body as to whether that's whether transparency is actually really desired or not. It is one of those key questions. So particularly for corporate bodies, you need to know who you're dealing with and what your business is exposed to. But the legislative bodies above that may necessarily have different political allies or different international relations that they're dealing with and have a very different risk or control threshold for what actually might be desirable on the macro level. Certainly what we are seeing is more and more increases in global trade. Of course, Brexit might slow down that global trade element, but we're all in an interconnected supply chain. So what goes in one country more often than not goes cross borders as well. So we are fully dependent on international trade, on global management of that trade and dealing with business partners outside of the countries that we're operating in. So understanding what the laws and the legalities are in each of those different countries and whether they still meet the standards for where you are is massively important. And of course, having information that goes across those borders and being able to check that they are the right people that you know that you're dealing with and don't, as well as cultural differences and an understanding about which is the first name, which is the surname, and which is just a very, very common name that could accidentally cause more violations to be seen and understood is a very, very murky world. That what John Smith in the UK, for example, might be a very, very common name. How do you know whether that's the one that you're interested in or the one that you're not interested in? So working out those cultural differences and understanding fact from potential fiction is a hard task to achieve. And finally, the frequency of transactions. So gone are the days where you could just do a batch schedule and it would complete within a couple of minutes with hundreds of thousands of transactions going through the books each month. We're now in the millions per day. Potentially that changes depending on what business you're in, but we're seeing a lot more frequency and higher volumes of transactions that are going through as the global trade gets more complex and as the supplier networks get more complex as well. So the timeliness of action and the importance of satisfying those greater volumes mean that it's really, really difficult to continue to do that manually on a periodic basis and still guarantee that you're meeting both the legal and the desirable levels of control that you want. So, given what we've just said about the importance of the business partners that we're having to deal with and the current ways of working, understanding some of the changes that have happened at the macro and the individual levels in terms of business operations, do we still think that those old school ways of running business partner screening is sufficient? Andrew, what's your view?
Most commonly not. You know, it's fine if you have a handful of suppliers, but as you said, that's an unrealistic goal for most. You know, most will have hundreds, thousands, if not millions of suppliers, vendors, business partners, customers, people they are constantly trying to identify and screen. So manual is, doing anything manually these days is a challenge, especially as you said, with millions of transactions a day. You know, it's just not there. Some of the other challenges we see, most data is out of date. If you're not using an up-to-date sanctions list or even up-to-date customer list, you're not necessarily referencing the most up-to-date information. If you're using the supplier questionnaires and then you use that form and update it once a year, are you entirely sure you've still got the accurate data about ownership, stakeholders, their stance on certain policies you might have within your organization flagged as important? It's hard to see what's updated. Many existing tools just do record was last updated last week without necessarily specifying the details of what and where, making it harder to drill into what exactly has changed. Hard to spot discrepancies. That example Simon used for John Smith is a good one. There's a lot of people called John Smith here in the UK. Is that the John Smith you want? Can they get around that by writing their name as Jonathan Smith? How about the person who entered your data as limited, LTD instead of limited, or street as ST? Some of these manual checks and manual tools fall over when it cannot match this data. You miss entire positive cases of items you need to investigate because the data isn't necessarily isn't able to differentiate between the two or assumes they're completely different. So there's a lot of challenges with doing these things manually or with some of the other tools out there which don't necessarily handle the volume or changes that we are now seeing in the world on a regular basis. And of course, that one there, cannot spot infiltrators, is quite a key one as well. Ownerships of companies change. You might have personal block lists of companies you don't want to work with, banks you don't want to work with. It's very easy for these individuals or institutions or organizations to work their way back into your supplier list by changing their name, taking ownership of an existing supplier, and keeping track of that manually is a challenge.
Very much so. And again, going back to your point about the timeliness of information, if Turnkey were vetted and compliant today, who's to say that we didn't employ somebody who then had links to known terror groups or climate activists or somebody who was going to target potentially some clients that we had in a key business sector. Now, if that customer had particular screening requirements that meant that they were particularly interested in particular activist groups, and somebody joined our employee at that point in time, then there should be some sort of check and validation that Turnkey is still okay to do business with. Now, again, we take this very, very seriously, and we do proper background checks on all of our employees and understand exactly what we're taking on. Some suppliers may not be quite so diligent, and we could be introducing risk into our supply chain or our customers' supply chain by virtue of hiring potentially the wrong person. So moving on to some of the tooling challenges, how does BIS solve this particular problem? Andrew, I think this is one for you.
Most certainly is. So some of the reasons why I love business integrity screening. Now, business integrity screening, I'm going to focus largely on that business partner screening element of the tool, but all parts of the tool can be combined and add even more benefits to your business partner screening. So one of the biggest ones is granularity. No matter what you're focusing on, you can customize the tool to drill into it. So whether you're focusing on politically exposed people, adverse reports, or looking more for foreign laws you might not have visibility of in your organization, you can drill into all these specific use cases and investigate that. BIS works by importing a sanctions list into your tool, and you can drill into any single asset of that for your entire business partner estate. So lots of checks to do in as much detail as you want. It also allows you to resolve some of that fuzziness with street names. Is that John Smith the same person? What if I enter my name as Andy instead of Andrew? It can look at wider data available in all these sanctions lists to pinpoint, is this the company, person, bank that I'm actually interested in? Or is it just a coincidental name? Someone sharing that same name of John Smith. So it really lets you drill into it. And of course, out of the box, it provides a number of checks against the sanctions list you can customize it to. You can run those checks against, and then you can use some of the enhanced functionality within BIS itself to perform additional checks. So if you want to perform additional checks, such as making sure a business partner doesn't have the same bank account as another business partner, or something like that. You can customize it to be the exact checks that you want, or checking against a blocked list. There might be certain banks or individuals you do not want to work with. You can customize it to check exactly what you want. For timeliness, there's 3 main ways checks are done. Manual investigation, so running a scan against a customer. Someone's raised a question, you can perform a check against it. But more commonly, what we see is updating everyone in bulk. If there's an update to the sanctions list, checking every single business partner overnight or during the daytime, so that you get a fresh set of insight into your business partners. So whether you have 500 or 5 million, it can scan everybody every single time that sanctions list is updated. The other common way, of course, that most customers do it is upon creation of supplier. So upon business partner creation, upon payment, or upon some other trigger within SAP, performing that check there and then, and if needed, block it or flag it for investigation. So rather than making a payment, creating a business partner, and then realizing after the fact they should not have been created or accepted, it will and can, if you choose to, block it in real time and flag that for investigation.
I think that's one of the key things that we see that is pretty unique, in that rather than just doing it periodically, as and when there's a new vendor created, we're actually checking the details at the point at which any transaction is processed. And by processed, I mean any payments that are being asked to run either to that supplier or when the customer is actually processing an order, you can actually run a check right there and then. And that really does limit your exposure to unwitting payments being made or updates being made into your data set. That really is one of the key points.
Absolutely. The world isn't black and white in terms of do we allow things. Often there's questions, often there's exceptions, and BIS allows you to perform to balance those in a scale of probability. So for example, you might have a complete block on politically exposed people unless it's this certain department of this certain government in this certain country. So there might always be exceptions to, or if there's been an adverse report, but it's over so many years ago, you can set the scales on the weighting on each individual item. So for certain items, you might get more points than the others. So politically exposed people might be more chance of it getting blocked than an adverse report. But you can customize it based on the metadata it can see, the business partner, the address, the country, the sanctions list. And so if in doubt, it can get flagged for investigation rather than just a straight block or allow. So if someone needs to go and investigate it, they can. So it allows for those gray areas or a second review, or for somebody, a bit more fine detail and investigate, looking at multiple data points to make a decision rather than just it's a politically exposed person block. You can do that data analysis and do that weighting on it. And ultimately, you can automate all these controlled decisions. So do you want everything to go to a team to investigate manually? Are there straight up blocks? And again, that can be done real time with SAP. So upon a business partner creation, it can either flag it to say it's allowed, it doesn't meet our, no negative criteria, it's fine. Flag it for investigation, it goes to somebody to manually review and approve, or just straight up automatically block it. And again, the same when you're running those jobs overnight or whenever for comparing it to the updated sanctions lists, it can instantly go through and just block those business partners from operating and flag any currently in process or payments, for example. So really powerful tool. And as you perform investigations to say false positive, false negative, this one's allowed, this one isn't, BIS can learn from that and adjust those scales so that you get less and less false positives for your team to investigate. So over time, it will learn your organization even better and reduce the amount of effort you have to put into it.
Excellent stuff. And I think going back to your point about the balance of probability and the sort of automated decision screening as well, you can tailor it to volumes that you can handle as well. So if you've only got one person who's looking at all of these kinds of alerts, you can overwhelm that one person very, very quickly. So maybe your tolerance level needs to be set a little bit higher or lower, depending on the capacity of the resolving teams. And although we might want to block every single payment transaction, if we did that with 100%, then your business might stop overnight. and we all know how frustrating it is when suppliers don't get paid. So having an appreciation of what's the real world and what's the actual business driver for this, as well as meeting the compliance objectives, is really where we want to be from a sweet spot point of view. So Andrew, very technical slide here in terms of the solution, but can you just talk us through very briefly, obviously factoring in we haven't got 16 years left of the webinar, how this actually kind of works?
You don't want 3 days of training in 10 minutes, then fine. So at a high level, so it all starts with those sanctions lists or lists from partners such as Refinitiv. You know, they'll update the sanctions list as required, typically daily. That will be pulled into BIS, along with any relevant data that you're looking at, you know, any relevant to the business partner screening. The analysis engine, that's the key there. So that is what can be accessed in real time, in mass, or on demand to investigate certain business partners. But that's where it takes the data you have selected and set up in the system and weighs it. You know, are they politically exposed people? Are there adverse reports? Is there any foreign laws relevant, such as where the bank is located versus where the company is registered? What country are they registered in, and the owners, and so on and so on. So any data you want, that's that big data engine crunches it all down inside HANA and performs it in real time for you. Off the back of that, there's typically 3 outcomes. It's fine, no issue, carry on. There's an alert, so it's triggered some form, it's tipped the scale too far in one way, and we need someone to investigate it manually. Now, like most SAP tools, that's workflow driven, so it can be restricted to certain people in certain departments. Maybe you have an expertise in sanctions lists versus adverse reports versus politically exposed people. So you can make sure those alerts, depending on what has been detected, goes to the right people to investigate. And as case managers, you can see what's being investigated, where they are, what's the hold up. And so when the business might query, why hasn't my payment been made? Why hasn't my business partner been investigated? It's all clear within the system where it is, what has triggered it, what's flagged it, and who's it with. The other third option, of course, is that automatic blocking. As we said, you know, there will be cases where you said, this is too much of a risk, just block it. They might be on an internal block list you've already set up. So that can all be done. And those investigations is the key of that engine. It displays exactly what has been triggered, why, the fuzziness, so you can investigate whether it was an Andrew or an Andy or the wrong John Smith. So you can investigate, and SAP BIS will learn from those. So every time you approve, block, or otherwise investigate an issue, BIS will get quicker and quicker every single time.
Fantastic. So yeah, not quite 3 days of training in 10 minutes, but that's really useful to understand at the high level exactly how the tooling works. So now that we've covered the importance of business partner screening, we've had a brief look into what has changed in the operational world, and had a very brief look at what the functionality of business integrity screening can give us and how it actually kind of hangs together. We have got a few minutes left for questions, and I did see that there were a few that had come through whilst you were talking, Andrew. So the first one on the list was, can we integrate with other GRC tools, like with audit? So let me give you my view on that, and Andrew, please interrupt me at any point with some additional or potentially correct information. But we see BIS as that massive, great, big compliance analysis engine. So from that perspective, it's the engine room for how you might execute a load of the controls, but it isn't necessarily the compliance brain. It doesn't provide that internal governance and that oversight into the world of what the business risk is, or what the actual controlling objective is. So we do like to see BIS integrated with a wider GRC platform, particularly in the SAP world, where you'd have something like process control and risk management that providing the purpose. And then we'd rely upon business integrity screening to do that at scale, complexity, and volume, using the HANA databases to actually provide that real-time control measure. So BIS would be the mechanism by which the controls are achieved, but process control risk management would provide the reason for why those controls are required. And that really is where we see BIS coming into its own. Process control can do some of it with the CCM capabilities and the automated monitoring framework, but when you're doing things at scale with an additional level of complexity, or you need that shade of gray and that balance of probability as to whether something is kind of okay or really not, that's when we start seeing the requirement for BIS to come through.
Yeah,
anything to add on that, Andrew?
Let's say absolutely, and just from a technical point of view, its data is fully exposed to the rest of the GRC suite. So if you're looking at making sure that business partners are screened in a timely manner, investigations are followed up from a audit or process controls point of view, you can absolutely do that and use BIS as the master control, as it were. So absolutely possible to integrate the tools.
Fantastic. So we do have another question. About the investigation strategy. Does it require HANA Studio as a prerequisite?
So it requires HANA as a database, absolutely, but all the investigation strategies are written now in ABAP script. So they're deployed to the HANA database that way. So not necessarily via Studio anymore.
Fantastic, fantastic. So yeah, another question. Like in process control, we can have manual controls. How do we propose or purpose clients to cover manual reviews with SAP BIS? So Andrew, I think you were mentioning earlier about once you've written your detection and investigation strategies, finding how you screen and at what point you deploy those is one of those three ways. You can have it event driven, you can have it, I suppose, pre-scheduled as a batch, or you can do a manual check there and then. And I think that's probably the answer to that question, I would have thought, where you can still have the manual capability to run the analysis as and when you wish, but we find that the controls are far more effective when you take away that manual driven task and you do it at scale, ideally when the event is triggered that you need to screen.
Absolutely, yeah. And you can do anything manually you can with the automated job. So scanning individual people, measuring it, running investigations. So it's flexible to run how you need it to run for the organization.
Sure. So we've got two questions here that are pretty much the same. One that's saying, can we have a business use case for demonstration in the system? And another one that's saying, can we have a technical session after this to see exactly how the tool works? And of course, great to see that there's that kind of level of interest. And of course, yeah, we will put on some sort of technical session in the future, or we can, if you get in touch with us, we can do a dedicated one for your client. But yeah, the business use cases that we tend to see in general terms, of course, sanctioned parties, where we've got somebody who is either an individual or a corporate level sanctioned party. We can run through some of those where the payment should be blocked just because of somebody who's got an embargo check against their name or against the organization. So we've got some of those demo scenarios where we can put those things in place. We've also got demonstrations where we can show copy invoices or duplicate invoice checks. And again, those sorts of things are a little bit more, well, murky and grey, because you could have various different elements that would have problems to identify easily, particularly around duplicate payments. It could be that the price is the same or the invoice is the same value. It's coming from the same vendor, but maybe a different entity that's singularly owned. It could well be that it's timestamps. So, for example, if you've got a service contract and you pay the same thing every month, and you've got many different invoices that are the same vendor, the same value, but one was accidentally submitted twice in a month versus one the next month, you could have those different things that would fall those different checks. So looking at some of those and weighting those different options so that they can trigger or not, we've got all of those kind of scenarios that we can show you. But predominantly looking at the business partners, it's looking at multiple individuals, multiple corporates that either have got a check against them that says that they shouldn't be dealt with, and then we can show that how that payment is proposed for a block or actually blocked until it's released by somebody else who's validated that it is legitimate or a false positive. So some examples of use cases that were implemented in clients. Well, I've just given some of those use cases, but we've deployed BIS in various different guises. Some entertainment platform providers where people are buying in-app games and doing kind of skins and scaling up of weaponry within those gaming platforms. We've deployed BIS to manage every single one of those transactions at the point of which they're requested for, and checking each and every one of those environments. So that really does show you the high volumes that are capable and the level of compliance checks to prove that the payment was legitimate. So that's one of the best examples that we go to, where all of the platforms are governed by it, and then we are talking about millions of transactions, albeit at low values, but high volumes, where we're able to give all of those sort of screening comfort across to the client, and it doesn't interfere at all with the business operations and the payment successes.
Yeah, other just common ones that we see are for regulatory reasons. So many countries around Europe will have restrictions on valid vetting of bank accounts. So does the bank account for the organization match the country? Just trying to stop data monetary transfers outside the EU or restrictions on certain countries. So that's a common use case that we've seen, scanning through the business partners and suppliers to make sure that the bank and the country of origin of the organization match, or certainly that the bank's location is not on a sanctions list where that country is not allowed to trade with. So we've deployed it in that use case a number of times now.
Indeed. So we've got another couple of technical questions. So one saying the ABAP script version, what is the version that is allowed? Is it on 1.5 or is it an earlier version? I think we'll probably have to get back to you on that, but it's quite a new tool, and therefore the versions that are in use are the latest and greatest, but we'll confirm the exact version and get back to you directly on that one. So how does BIS differ from GTS in its performance of screening activities? So Andrew, obviously we've got sanction party screening that's inherent within GTS, but that for me is much more rudimentary. It doesn't go down to the fine levels of granularity that business integrity screening can do, in particular down to the independent and the individual. But for me, a lot of it more is in the scale and the complexity and the way that the investigation objects are analysed and alerted. So being able to gaze into those shades of grey to understand whether it's actually a true violation or whether there's a degree of doubt. Anything to add on that particular front, Andrew?
No, I'd agree. For me, the strength of BIS over GTS, and don't get me wrong, if GTS meets your requirements, that's excellent. But where BIS really excels is the ability to customize and fine tune it. So the balance of scales, as Simon covered, but also pulling in additional data. Really using any data within your organization, be it in SAP or otherwise, to help as part of these checks. So, checking for that no vendor is a vendor doesn't share a bank account with an employee, or, any ad hoc checks, just really being able to customize it to a very fine detail, and then flag the importance of that as part of your sanctions list going forward. So for me, that's the strength of BIS.
Fantastic. Now, we have a final question, which is always the one we get on these sorts of things. But one of the attendees has said, are there any tentative license and implementation costs for the product? Let me give you the same answer that we always give you. It depends. So if you've got a smaller use case and you're not screening too many vendors and you haven't got a massive amount of data and financial revenues flowing through it, then the implementation costs and the license costs will, of course, be smaller. But where the license costs ramp up is on volumes of checks, how many vendors you're checking for or other business partners that you're checking for. And of course, then the criticality and the granularity of what sorts of checks you're needing to validate. So licenses are generally based upon the business partners, the volume of business partners you're using. The implementation will be on the granularity and the scale at which you want to do it. But you can start small, you can grow the dependence on it, and you can really go very, very deep into the functional levels and the compliance objectives of it. So hopefully I've given you absolutely zero knowledge of what the exact costs will be, because it always depends on exactly the implementation and the scale at which you want to use it.
Absolutely. And out the box, it can be deployed quite quickly if you're not looking for too much customization. But as always, depending on the amount of interfaces, real-time checks, in terms of process interruption, that can change just the level of effort required, as you would expect. There is one more question around this, Simon, on the topic. So knowing ACS and BIS is an integrated solution, do we need additional licensing for BIS? So yes, we do. BIS is a separately licensed product. The licensing, as Simon said, depends on typically on business partner, but depending on other data elements or exactly what you might need for the tool, there might be additional license costs. So as always, consult with your SAP business partner.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, specifically on some of the more, the non-business partner screening elements of it, there was pricing that was based upon revenues and the number of reported revenue units that you were pushing through the system as well. So what revenue were you safeguarding by it? But SAP are changing a lot of the license models, particularly where they're moving to much more cloud orientated infrastructure and being a cloud provider. So SAP will have to answer some of those questions on the licensing, but there's definitely ways to get started on the journey. I did spot another one as well, just on customer data quality, and can BIS understand and reject bad quality data? Go on, Andrew.
if they're on the sanctions list, yes. So if a customer maliciously puts through bad data to try and bypass your sanctions check, then yeah, absolutely, it can say, well, wait a minute, this person actually belongs to this company, or this bank account belongs to this one. So it can help clarify where fraudulent information has been entered. In terms of inconsistent data, it can help with that as well. So whether you put, as I said earlier, street, STREET, or street ST, or Andy or Andrew, or limit LTD, etc., etc., BIS can work around that. So, in terms of quality from customers and consistency, it doesn't really make a difference. But if a customer is straight up putting data down and they're not on a sanctions list, a bit more challenging to try and spot when it's wrong. But it can help, but it's not necessarily a solution, a bulletproof solution for resolving all data quality issues.
I think just to add to that, the other element that we see is using that bar setting or that threshold management to really predict just how much do you want to report. It sounds counterintuitive that, of course, everybody always wants to report everything that could be potentially problematic, but getting your head into the operational world for a second, understanding how much you can tolerate and where to focus your attention to have the biggest positive impact on risk is where people need to start. And therefore setting your tolerance and scaling that level of alerting, or the level of information that you then have to deal with is a real good way of actually just focusing on the good quality data and then taking steps to resolve some of the poorer quality as we go. But it's all about scale. What we wanted to hopefully put in front of you today is the fact that the sanction party screening and the business partner screening more generally is a highly critical element of good practice governance. If you don't have the controls on the business partners that you're working with, and you can't satisfy either regulators or your own shareholders or yourselves that you're doing the right thing by your business partners, then you are leaving yourself massively open to attack, whether that's from fraud or from regulators or from just good practice, reputational damage. Then it's not really an area that can be afforded to be ignored any longer. And with the complexity that we're dealing with and the scales and volumes that we're also dealing with, doing it manually once a year with a little bit of self-assessment probably doesn't cut it anymore. So unfortunately, we're at time. As you can appreciate, Andrew and I could go on and on and on for days talking about this particular topic, but all that's really left is to say thank you very much for listening. My contact details are here on the screen. Andrew, I'm not quite sure how you've managed to dodge that one and not get yours there, but well done for you for that. yeah, keep an eye on this topic. We'll be talking more about it, I'm sure, over the coming weeks and months. There is also one that our German colleagues will be doing in the local German language as well. So keep your eyes and ears pinned for that one. And yeah, any further governance and risk and compliance type topics that we're talking about will come on in this format, but we're also looking at launching a podcast in the nearish future as well. So you can start listening to us talking about it either more passionately or dispassionately, depending on the topic. Keep your ears out listening for those sorts of topics.
Absolutely. And if you do, because my name isn't listed, if you do want me, it's a similar format, andrew.morris@turnkeyconsulting.com. So we're more than happy to have any conversations after this session.
All that says is thank you very much for listening, and I'm sure we'll speak to you all soon.
Thank you.